Getting miniatures painted up and on the table in record time may not be the most rewarding way to enjoy this hobby. But sometimes, when faced with an entire mob of unpainted miniatures, it's necessary to crank through the painting process as quickly as possible to preserve what's left of one's sanity. Since releasing my original old school speed painting video, I have made some significant refinements to this speed painting process that will yield better looking results in a shorter period of time. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. In my original old school speed painting video, I followed a typical base shade highlight approach to speed painting using a dip wash to shade the miniatures. This standard order of operations creates three issues for the overall process of batch painting such a large gaggle of miniatures. First, by using the dip wash in between the base layer step and the highlight step of the process, there is a window of 2 to 6 hours of downtime while the polyurethane wash dries. The second issue that I found is that this particular order of speed painting application adds an additional step to the process. The polyurethane dip dries very glossy and therefore should receive a matte varnish before continuing with the highlight layer, which will also require another matte varnish over the highlights. Finally, when adding the highlights, I used a single desaturated light green color for all of the highlights. Because these raw highlights were applied after the dip wash, they didn't really feel integrated into the piece, and I ultimately didn't care for how they looked. So today we remedy all of those issues. I'm going to give the miniatures a dip wash as the very final step so that when we're done with that step, we walk away from the project with it completed. This requires one small tweak to the dip wash, which I'll cover when we get there. This will reduce the total amount of time it takes to complete the project by eliminating that intermediate matte varnish step, and because we don't have to wait for the dip wash to dry before we apply the highlights. Not only that, but since the highlights are being applied before the dip wash, the highlights will look more integrated to the piece and have a more refined overall look. Of course, I begin by hooking up all 14 zombie runner miniatures with my favorite painting handle. A little hot glue and some deck screws is all that's required. Once on the handle, they can be set anywhere where there is a piece of cardboard. This helps immensely with the workflow of assembly line painting. I pick up a mini from the unpainted staging area, apply whatever paint that step requires, and then set it down on the opposite side of the cardboard surface before continuing on to the next miniature. Another perk of this inexpensive and versatile handle is that I can have a whole gaggle of miniatures primed and ready to go at the same time. This makes speed painting my way through miniature heavy games like Zombicide a breeze. For this particular set of miniatures, I'm choosing a light tan Rust-Oleum camo paint for the primer. This color will serve as the base for the zombie skin, thus saving me from having to paint the skin by hand. When batch painting, eliminating even one color from the base layer step can save a considerable amount of time. From here, I go right into highlighting the skin with a little pale yellow Pro Acryl. I decided to dry brush this color onto the model, choosing speed over accuracy. I use my favorite dry brush palette to remove much of the paint from the dry brush before running the brush over the miniatures. This is the most carefree step in the process since we don't have any other colors on the mini. We're free to hit all areas with this highlight. The presence of the lighter highlight color on other areas will only help us as we base coat the rest of the miniature. Color selection for the base layer step is pretty straightforward. Remembering that we're going to use a wash over these base colors, I choose a color that is a little brighter than what I want the mid-tone color to be. Since triad color systems are all the rage now, simply choosing a color that is one triad step brighter than the envisioned mid-tone color is an easy solution to color selection. The final wash will stain the base layer ever so slightly as it works its way into all of the recesses on the miniature. These Black Plague runners are made up of two different sculpts, and this reddish color will only appear on this variant of the runner. Since I'm simultaneously batch painting two different variants of the same creature, it's important that I use the same colors on both models as much as possible. This is the most efficient way to paint quickly. Every additional color that I add to my palette will add time to the project. For this project, I have severely limited my color palette, all in the name of speed. The hooded zombie will use 3 base colors, and the shirtless zombie will only use 2 base colors. The only 2 colors on the shirtless zombie will also make up 2 of the 3 colors for the hooded zombie. The beautiful thing about batch painting is that with each model painted, the process gets faster. It starts out a little slow as I work to discover the nuances and intricacies of each sculpt. Then, before I realize it, I've perfected my approach and I'm getting each attribute of the miniature covered in as few strokes as possible. What you see in my videos is usually the first couple of miniatures that I paint, as this is the time when I'm highly focused on keeping the miniature in camera view. This also means that this is as slow as my painting gets. The The third and final cover for the zombies is going to be a fairly neutral color for the accent pieces. This includes items like boots, wraps, straps, and pouches. I actually like to use a slightly darker neutral color for these items so as to not detract from the primary colors of the piece. If every color on the miniature is bright, then nothing will stand out. Something like a dark brown or gray color usually works. These bits will get a touch of a light dry brush highlight so that the details of the piece are visible. To keep things fast and smooth, all of the blue and gray elements on these models will get the same light blue highlights. I'm basically using a dry brush technique for these highlights to maintain a good pace, but I'm using a much smaller brush so that I don't make a mess of things. Quick doesn't mean it has to be sloppy. I just need to hit a few of the raised surfaces to bring out the finer details in these runners' garments. The last garment that we need to tend to is a red shirt. I'm choosing salmon rose to accentuate this piece. I think that it makes a nice extreme highlight for red that does not look too pink. Finally, I like to add any effects to my miniatures before the wash goes on. Here I'm adding a little glistening blood effect to the tongue and mouth. I'm doing this now because I don't want to have to wait for the wash to dry to continue painting the miniature. Once the wash is on, the miniature is complete and I walk away. Also, as you'll see in a moment, the wash is thin enough that it won't obscure these colors too much, and the wash will help hide any flaws with my application and allow the effect to integrate with the rest of the paint scheme more naturally. This final touch only takes a few seconds per miniature. And this is where the magic happens. I'm using my poor man's dip wash for this. Minwax polyurethane wood stain and sealer isn't super cheap, but it's at least half the cost of the Army Painter version. When choosing a dip wash, I feel it's important to go with the gloss finish. I've tried several brands and finishes, and I find that the matte and satin finishes stain the underlying paint layers way too much. The gloss finish flows over the raised surfaces and into the recesses without staining the underlying colors too much. For this particular method, I've decided to thin the polyurethane stain with more odorless mineral spirits than usual. The highlights are already in place, so I don't want to obliterate them with a heavy stain. The goal is to only shade the recesses with minimal impact on the other areas of the miniature. You can see that there is no exact measuring here. I basically go by feel. If you have a brand new can of this polyurethane stain, pouring out about 1/8 of the can, preferably into a mason jar for later use, and then topping off the can with mineral spirits should do the trick. The main speed trick for this dip step is to use a power drill to spin the excess wash off the miniature after dipping. This is a one and done step that saves a ton of time. The centrifugal force of the spin removes any excess wash, so there is no need for shaking, nor will I have to come back to the Mini to mop up any pooling. I remove the Mini from the drill, set it aside, and forget about it. When dipping the Mini, I dip it until the wash just barely contacts the top of the base. Then I spin the miniature just fast enough to remove the excess wash. I do not spin the drill at full speed. Centrifugal force is pretty powerful stuff, and it is possible to spin the miniature right off the end of the screw if I get too crazy with it. While spinning, I place the Mini in a container to catch the spray flying off the Mini. I gently spin the miniature until I no longer see little drops of wash forming on the inside wall of the container. Then it's on to the next miniature. The end result is a great looking miniature, all 14 of them all painted up in about 90 minutes. All that's left to do is paint the base, apply a matte clear coat, and remove them from the painting handles. I hope you enjoyed this little blast from the past speed painting technique. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters who like to get shit done quickly.